As part of our preparation for the fiesta of the Cathedral Parish of San Roque, yesterday afternoon, I gave a recollection about the life and mission of San Roque. There was a part in the story that I could not make much sense about until I read about the so-called LSIs in Metro Manila. I wonder if you are familiar with that abbreviation, LSI. LSI is an abbreviation for locally stranded individuals who are trying to get back to their own provinces. They had been locked down in Metro Manila, perhaps because they came here to visit a relative, hoping at the same time to find a job, or at least find new opportunities in the big city. Unfortunately for them, they have been caught unawares and overtaken by the pandemic. They have run out of money, and even the relatives that they thought they could rely on could no longer accommodate them. They could not avail themselves of any ayuda or assistance from the barangay or the LGU because they are not in the list of beneficiaries. In short, they are what you might call local migrants. And so, they found their way to a sports complex where they were herded together in order to be profiled. And they patiently waited, hoping to be able to get some government assistance, to avail themselves of free food, a space to lay their mats on, inside the roofed Coliseum, which gets wet, especially during rainy season, and to avail themselves also free transportation for their return to their provinces. Now, why did all of this get me to understand the plight of San Roque? Well, during those times before the nation-states existed in Europe, San Roque was, for all practical purposes, an LSI himself, a locally stranded individual. He was a native of Montpellier and was on a pilgrimage to Rome when he got himself locked down in the cities along the way that had been struck by the pandemic. And the pandemic back then was the bubonic plague. If our COVID-19 comes from the bats, the bubonic plague comes from the rats. Since San Roque was young and healthy, and please take note, he was not an old man. I was saying in my recollection yesterday, I asked a group of young people here in the parish what they know of San Roque, and one of them said, yun pong matandang ermitanyo na may aso. The old man, the hermit with a dog. I said, everything you said was correct, except that he was an old man. He was about as old as you, I said. And the one I was talking to was about 20 years old. I said, San Roque, he was only 20 years old when he left his hometown. He was only 32 years old when he died. And he went out of his way to serve as a healthcare volunteer. And I'm trying to revive the concept with his cofradías de San Roque. Healthcare volunteers, in order to serve the infected ones who were being attended to in a quarantine facility. Hospitals back then were basically quarantines. And like our modern-day frontline health workers, he himself got infected. When he was still healthy, he was very welcome to do volunteer work, even if he was a stranger or an LSI. But when he got infected, he was no longer welcome. Why? Because the quarantine facility was only for the local citizens. In short, Roque was not in the list of beneficiaries of quarantine service. Our gospel today is about that general tendency in society towards a strict definition of insiders and outsiders, of members and non-members, beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries, whether on the basis of religion, political affiliation, citizenship, or just the color of your skin. Why were the disciples asking Jesus to send away the woman? Well, she was a Canaanite, meaning she was not in their list of prospective beneficiaries of the services of Jesus. As far as they were concerned, Jesus was actually already being very kind by expanding his own list of beneficiaries to include the so-called lost sheep of the house of Israel. Even within the Jewish society, they had a very well-defined system of exclusion. Right among their fellow Israelites, there were classes of people who were ostracized. And being a compassionate shepherd who attended not only to the 99 within the fold, but also to the stray, Jesus went against the culture of exclusion. He referred to the excluded ones as the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But take note, the woman in the gospel today did not even belong to Israel. She was a pagan, a non-Jew, a non-member of the chosen people. That is why she did not even seem to take offense at being treated like a dog. She was practically called a dog. I was a bit scandalized by that. Remember what Jesus said? It is not right to get food from the master's table and throw it to the dogs. Well, he was simply trying to explain to her that he had to attend first to the members of the family before giving away some leftovers to the dogs, meaning the non-Israelites. But the woman, she did not mind being called a dog as long as she could avail herself of some crumbs, some little scraps of charity after all the listed beneficiaries were already served. The humility of the disposition of this woman had so moved Jesus. Jesus ended up saying, "Sige na nga. Woman, how great is your faith." Like I've said in a previous homily on the same gospel reading, because this gospel is repeating itself, I found myself wondering, what faith was Jesus talking about if this woman was not Jewish? meaning she was not a worshiper of the same God, Yahweh, of the Israelite people. I think Jesus was not talking about faith. I think what struck him was her love and her readiness to suffer humiliation. Isn't that the case with people who love? Readiness to suffer humiliation, if only to save her daughter. In Pinoy language, you know, we have a reference to a category of dogs and cats that do not belong to the family. Mga askal at pusakal. Meaning, mga asong kalye at mga pusang kalye. Askal and pusakal. In my younger years, I remember the word pusakal being used in reference to street dwellers and the regular law offenders who committed petty crimes, snatchers, thieves, pusakal. The modern term for their exclusion is othering. It is the same tendency at work when specific sectors of society are vilified or labeled as drug addicts, drug suspects, criminals, communists, subversives, terrorists, foreigners, etc. You know, this was Hitler's effective strategy, an effective populist strategy in isolating the Jews from the German society. It is how he succeeded in keeping people quiet, no talk, even if they were aware that he was murdering people, that he was exterminating them in gas chambers, as long as it was not their family. Remember the famous line by the German Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller, who said, and I quote, "First, they came for the Jews, but I did nothing because I was not a Jew. And then they came for the socialists, but I did nothing because I'm not a socialist. And then they came for the Catholics, but I did nothing because I'm not a Catholic. And finally, they came for me," he says. "But by then, there was no one left to help me." Back to the image of the dogs. I realize now that there is still a much lower category than the usual house dogs and house cats. And that's the stray dogs and the stray cats, mga askal at pusakal. What makes the story of San Roque particularly interesting, please take a look at the image. Today, I want to focus not on San Roque, but on the dog. The dog. What makes the icon particularly interesting is the role of that dog that you often see in the images, in the icons of San Roque. The story goes that when Roque got infected and was refused admission in the regular quarantine facilities because he was not listed as a citizen, he was forced to withdraw to a forest and isolated himself in an abandoned hut in that forest. And nobody welcomed him except what he thought was a stray dog that was there in the hut. The dog became his friend. You see, unlike human beings, the dogs, they don't perceive religious differences or ethnic differences or political differences. For a dog, you are either a threatening presence or a friendly presence, depending on how you come across to them. I don't mean to glorify the dog, but what restores our faith in humanity in the story of San Roque is that the dog, after all, turns out to be a house dog too. That it actually belonged to a farmer who tilled the farm next to the forest. And the farmer is a Catholic, a Christian. He eventually discovers that his dog had befriended a stranger, our dear San Roque, who, even if he was a stranger himself, was serving the infected people. And instead of driving him away, the farmer, whose name is Gotthard, he welcomes him and cares for him until he recovers. I would say that the farmer must have evangelized his dog pretty well by instilling in this pet, in this animal, the Christian virtue of welcoming a stranger. Remember Matthew chapter 25, where we are told at the last judgment, the Lord will say to the just, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Brothers and sisters, try communicating with somebody's baby, even if you are a stranger. And if you come across as a friendly face, the child will start smiling at you and will even play peekaboo with you. But as the child begins to grow, he is going to be told repeatedly, don't talk to strangers. That is how we start reinforcing the culture of othering. Our readings today are challenging the tendency towards othering. The prophet Isaiah declares, Yahweh declares, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. I think that's what Jesus also meant when he said, in my Father's house, there is a lot of space. There are many rooms. He's not narrow-minded. He can make space for all of us, even if we find it so difficult to make space for each other. In the patriarchal stories of the book of Genesis, you will see immediately that the act of welcoming strangers is considered as a virtue. They say that in the ancient nomadic culture, when the survival of a traveler could depend on the assistance that he could get from people he met on the way, welcoming a stranger was considered a virtue, because you'll never know. You might be welcoming an angel or God in disguise who will reward you for your good deed. Like the story of Abraham and Sarah. Of course, I know you will say that's too idealistic, because the practical side of you will remain cautious. And you will say, what if he is a criminal or a fugitive from the law? The most revolutionary thing about Christianity in the context of Judaism was precisely the impulse to break down the barriers of division that made people treat one another as strangers rather than regard each other as fellow travelers, as fellow sufferers, as fellow sojourners in this passing world. For me, one of the most beautiful lines written in St. Paul is Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, where he says, "There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free person. There is neither male nor female, because all of you are one in Christ Jesus."